Welcome and thank you all for joining us today for an Awake Security webinar. We've titled this one, How to Detect and Contain Maze Ransomware Before it Wreaks Havoc. Ransomware continues to cripple organizations, and while defenders always detect the threat, it is often because of their infrastructure being encrypted or they have received a ransom note. Detecting the threat at that point leaves the defenders with very few response options to contain the impact. We are joined today by Jason Beavis, Vice President of Awake Labs. Jason has more than 2 decades of experience responding to some of the world's most consequential breaches, from nation-state attacks to cyber criminals using ransomware and other destructive-like malware. Based on insights from his team and findings on our network detection and response platform, in the field, Jason has formulated strategies to hunt and identify maze adversaries during early stages of the attack lifecycle. This allows the victim to take remedial actions far quicker and often minimizes and even eliminates the impact of the ransomware event. If you have any questions or technical difficulties, as I said earlier, please use the Q&A and chat features we are watching. Jason, over to you, sir.
John, thanks, and really appreciate the intro. So everyone, we've got a lot of material we're going to cover today, and I'll go through a little bit of background of some of the history. I'm going to do some back and forth from kind of a high level to technical dive on some of the aspects. And then we've also got a white paper that goes more into depth that I'll sort of mention and leave you throughout the presentation so you can understand even more in depth what we've done. So just a quick background about myself. Shahab did a great job introducing me. If you want, you can follow me on Twitter. I think the key things to stress is I'm still a very hands-on executive that runs the Awake Labs portion of services over here, which is incident response and managed network detection and response. And I do spend a lot of my free time really looking through and digging into ransomware and intelligence around ransomware and doing network threat hunting across our platform. So it's stuff I enjoy. I'm a geek at heart. When we look at Maze, and I'll just sort of dive into some of the key aspects, for those of you who don't know the Maze ransomware, and I think you see there's possible variants now in SunCrypt that may use some of the same infrastructure, but it's definitely one of the harder items to deal with. And, more importantly, what's interesting is Maze sort of shifted the landscape of the actors becoming more malicious. And by that, they continually post data, and we now see lots of other ransomware actors doing the same thing and posting data into the environment. So you've posting data of the environment online, which really is becoming this sort of threat to the organizations. If they don't pay, it's going to be leaked. And what I find ironic is, Maze team basically keeps that phrase, keeping the world safe. So it's interesting to wonder, do they really think they're doing a better job by protecting orgs, by identifying these vulnerabilities, or is it just really a money game that is going on? But either way, we continually see ransomware is a very big challenge. It's obviously just growing phenomenally almost weekly as you track it, and Maze tends to be one of the more difficult ones to deal with. So over here, what we did at Awake is we spent a significant amount of time really dissecting, every aspect of public intelligence, and then some we had internal. And, when you look at it from its timeline, it's been around about a year at this point. And, the things we learned from watching all the different actors' actions in the environment were quite phenomenal. And one of the challenges you'll hear me talk about, when I first came over to Awake, we were looking for some of the encryption files, and in my mind, I was thinking, well, if all we're seeing is the encryption file on the network, then, we've already lost the ransomware battle at some level. If you take the file telling you got to pay ransom or the extension, of something being ransomed, the game's already over from that standpoint, and we're late. We haven't prevented anything at all. And that made me really kind of challenge the approach. So we started looking back all the way, into 2019, and we sort of just kind of mapped out some of the key items. And, you can see things continually ramping up. I put this together a few probably about a month ago. And then, what I did is I went through recently and I just sort of pulled what's in August. And for those of you who don't follow Shadow Intelligence, it's a pretty good resource on ransomware stuff. But just alone, Shadow Intelligence has published probably about 20 or so different victims of Maze in August. So if you think about that timeline and how it was, 1 or 2 orgs a month, things like that, and now we're up to sort of a full-fledged, attack surface on Maze where all these, immature from a security perspective or people who are not quick and dynamic at patching and things like that, they're really just struggling to keep up with the actor and defend against it. And you can see manufacturing especially being, hit in this space. Professional services, the interesting one. There's quite a few professional services getting hit, but it's kind of across the board when you look at it. And again, we can see if this is the volume in August, and it just keeps increasing, we're likely going to see the same trend going into September and forward until we really figure out some ways to combat somebody who's delivering these type of packages to organizations. So one of the interesting things we talk about is dwell time, and I know there's some shifts in different groups like Conti, and we'll talk to that at some point, but you still do have a timeline before the ransom kicks off in the organization, and that's what you're going to see I'm going to talk about quite a bit. So if it takes several days for the actor to get the data out, to get the right foothold and then deal with it, you need to get ahead of that. And it really takes kind of a combination of things if you're being comprehensive. And, if you don't have EDR, that is a phenomenal, technology you need to have in the endpoint. I mean, to pick up the malware, if you're still using legacy stuff, you're not going to pick it up. We come in over and over again on incident response, and we end up dropping our own EDR, stuff to do the investigation, and multiple times, it's older existing legacy AV type products that are being bypassed in many cases. Logging is also, again, very pivotal in this aspect. And I know a lot of you respond to this stuff, you know it, but if you can't get the right level of logging off of servers to find out when it occurred, and that, you end up rolling back to backups and getting reinfected because you didn't know when they came into the environment. You don't leave your investigators anything to really understand which account was probably compromised first. So you end up playing a cat and dog game between the actor, and that's never fun. And then we also know many organizations just struggle to monitor the network in general. I mean, in fact, many IR firms do. My experience is there's very few IR firms that actually have, a comprehensive approach to cover all three of these. And those that do, they know the value of each of them. If they've got the right level of logging, they can find stuff on applications no one else can. If they've got the right level of, endpoint and network, they find things out of the managed environment that sometimes brought the actors into the environment. So again, you really want to be focusing on all three of those. And one of the things we did, we wanted to challenge was, being a network company, we wanted to say, how can we look at this problem different than everyone else? We know endpoint software out there is good, but they know how to bypass it. We know, organizations should be doing the right level of logging, but maybe they aren't. Being that we're a network company, we really did take a focus 100% network on Maze and say, okay, if we detected encryption, it's too late. So how do we get ahead of that and see if we can identify things the actor would look for, mechanisms the actor would use, and start shutting all those avenues down and just making it more difficult for them to even get the foothold in the environment, get the level of access, as well as, detect them, before they're exfiltrating. So again, we looked at every stage of the MITRE chain and said, what can we do to try to pick them up before and shut them down from the environment? So when we broke that down, there's the common things, and I'll go through these, but, if you look at IOCs, if you're not doing IOCs, you're just, again, that's the low-hanging fruit. There's tons of open source items out there. In fact, some of the groups posted a lot of the Maze IOCs when you had the cognizant attack. OTX is a great source for IOCs, and great. So you can do that, and you can get a hit in the environment, and that'll tell you stuff. Again, that's not what I really want to focus on here. But if you're not doing that, that's the minimal, And in many cases, you may already be behind the gap when you're looking at that. But you want to make sure you do have IOCs, and the public IOCs should just be a given at this point on actors. It's always a challenge to take that data and operationalize it sometimes if they're coming out daily. But, you know, again, that is stuff that the actor, once it's out, they tend to change tactics, but that does help with certain items. Really how we use it is more for attribution. You know, one of the wonderful things of the Awake product is we pick up things that are generic, but we don't always know who or what they are. So IOCs help us deal with that, and we kind of use things like the Maze IOCs for attribution. So you can see here, you know, we were actually looking at SSH uploads to a direct IP, and I'll talk about this tactic at some level, but you'll see this is kind of an outlier item we see on the network where, you know, certain protocols, certain communications to rare or unique items will trigger items on the network. And then if we can also get attribution with that, it helps us understand, you know, who might be doing it. So those are, again, just things you need to be doing out of the box to be safe in the environment. Now, one of the things I did, and the white paper does a great job of breaking this down. I'm not going to go through these all in here, but each section of the white paper kind of breaks down the network tactics like this, and then looks at the network hunting as well as you know, different components on it. So you're going to see, I'll show a couple of these during this presentation, but the white paper goes through each MITRE section like this, and we'll break things down. And we're going to go into some of these and some of the key items as we walk through the rest of the presentation. So we all know phishing is a challenge, and I think if you look at the Verizon DBR report, it's I think number 2 or number 3. I think it's password ransomware phishing that you run into. But one of the things I want to stress is how we can uniquely hunt. So if phishing still wasn't that high up on the list and all the email and spam filters work, we wouldn't all have jobs today. But some of the things I want to do is just kind of show you, if you look at those items in front of you, those are all from one of the public postings of you know, IOCs, and you can see everything in those domains was within a certain time frame. So they were, you know, within a month time frame. And that becomes very important when hunting across the network, is being able to hunt things within time frames. COVID, we did the exact same thing. You know, we knew between March 12th and March 16th that all these new domains were coming out. They were associated with certain things, and we could isolate our hunting down to that. Maze is no different. You watch the actor, you watch when intelligence is burned, you start shifting and doing hunts on different segments of time. Usually they all come back to certain registers too. So, you know, on the situations with things like COVID, we saw that, you know, the initial domains were GoDaddy, things like that. In the case of Maze, almost every one of them in the publicized attacks were of the PDR domain registry there. So you want to look at kind of those similarities. What are all these new items coming up? You know, what's the timeline? Why are they all associated with 1 or 2 registers? And then you also dig into things like the doppelganger stuff. So when you think about that, you're looking at, you know, what's my company name and why are there derivatives of those domains going through my network? Is there stuff that was created, built at one time? Did they come into my network at a certain time? And are they associated with the register? Those give you great ways to hunt for stuff. And then also, can I exclude certain things that may be known and have good reputation? So even though we have all these different ways to look at phishing, you know, this is one of the ways we actually hunt and look for the Maze candidates across the board. We look for doppelganger domains, we look at them at register, we look at them over segments of time, and then we investigate and pivot on those investigations. RDP is another one. I think I saw a tweet the other day that was just, it was funny. The person said, hey, if you're being attacked by this ransomware, the answer is RDP. And I mean, in reality, most ransomware today is RDP. And if you're not seeing the scans and that, you're probably not monitoring something right. But, you know, RDP is one of the #1 ways every single ransomware group is getting in today. You know, you should be able to detect these pretty easy. You're seeing multiple connections, you know, come across. Just this morning, I was on with somebody, and, you know, they're like, hey, we got 300 or 500 things at 3 a.m. from Russia hitting us overnight. You know, those are very simple signs that you should be seeing in the organization. you know, they're not anything that's difficult to detect. So again, you know, keep your eye on RDP, what it's getting through. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about how you can find beyond that here as we move forward. So again, RDP, you either look at the protocol, you want to look at the protocol level, you want to look at the port level. So those are different ways you can hunt for it. And, you know, other things that we've seen are pretty valuable is when you're looking across the board, you're going to see a lot of times the destination packets are pretty low. So these are people, they're just simply running, you know, admin accounts and stuff through. One of the key things that we find, and we usually compare on our incident response engagements, is we get called all the time of, hey, I've got malware, it's locking out my accounts, I don't know what to do. And, you know, if you just go up and look at what's the external footprint of emails, who in your company's been hit, you know, and associated with like, have I been pawned data, you know, those are likely the accounts you're seeing come through and being used as brute force. So any of those that have exposures outside, you know, they're prime targets that will be used against your RDP. So if you have anyone that is an RDP account allowed into the org, you need to be checking those items to reduce the footprint on them. And again, you know, it should be pretty easy to detect these scans come through. One of the offset items, we have everybody looking for RDP, but there's also things outside of RDP that can tell you RDP's gone through or is happening in the environment. We had an example recently where you know, the group swore they didn't have RDP enabled on their network. I've actually had a couple of these, you know, sometimes it's a third party who didn't configure the external, you know, firewall or router correctly. And in this case, we had a real interesting work from home situation where, you know, users are all working from home. The network maybe doesn't have visibility on every aspect of that. And what happened is this one user plugged their laptop directly into their router and had RDP enabled. And everyone swore it wasn't there or anything, but, you know, you end up getting account lockouts and things on the domain controller. So you have ways to pick that up via logging. And you also have the Kerberos responses that you can look at. So one of the things we do is we look at, you know, the responses of outdated Kerberos usernames. So those key items on there, the KDC revoked, the, you know, ticket revoked, and the key expired. If RDP is actually, you don't think it's open yet, you're seeing these errors come off of your systems, you want to look at those hosts and why. Maybe they have something else that you're not picking up. Maybe you don't have visibility from your endpoint, from whatever. And those are signs that RDP may be getting through your network and you don't have visibility on it. So you want to investigate those items and look and see if it's associated with RDP coming in. And why is that account constantly doing that action? Other times you will see their accounts lock out if it's done pretty heavy. So you have a couple of signs at that level. Network can pick up all this Kerberos stuff, and it's something we do hunt for on a regular basis and have models that trigger here away. Now, I'm going to shift to exploits a little, and we saw recently, I think just about every single vendor from F5 to Cisco to Citrix, like someone just decided they wanted to have fun and hit every one of these network appliances and post vulnerabilities on them. And we still see this being hit in several of the breaches today. One of the things that's really interesting about the network that is a little bit different than sort of the scan approach is, you know, all these have different URI strings that are tested from an actor when they're looking at stuff. So, for example, you know, if you have the NetScaler vulnerability, they're looking for this comp file, and then they'll actually, you know, look for an XML after it as part of the attack. You know, if it's exploited, there's an XML that usually comes after it with items. But the challenge you have is if you're doing vulnerability scanning, and we see that all the time where, you know, a qual scanner is going to hit something like this, and then, you know, from that aspect, you're actually seeing it. But, you know, if you don't patch it, or you have a 2-3 week delay before you can patch it, you know, one of the ways you can get ahead of that is you can actually hunt the network and watch for these items. So you can watch for people trying to actively exploit it. You can do different things like filter out, you know, some of that noisy traffic from your scanners and that, so you just ignore those devices, sources. And again, you're seeing these different exploits. They all have different paths that they're going to in many cases. that you're able to do a real-time check all the time versus that one-time, once-a-week scan or whatever that still continues shows you they're vulnerable. So this is one way we actually do. We hunt for vulnerability exploits, and then we try to build automated models that sit around and look for people trying to actively attack, and then we use that as pivot surfaces to dig into. So again, if you're not doing that and you're trusting your scanner, you're likely got a window of time that's a gap, and you may find out some got exploited days later, weeks later, whatever, that you weren't aware of because you're just running the scan and patch approach. So one of the other things I want to dig a little bit deeper on phishing again. When we look at the phishing stuff, again, I mentioned that there's always stuff that goes outside of the email filter, and even though I talked about all the different domain stuff, there's larger sets of data you can go through that help sort of dig into things. So if you think about, what's the outbound email traffic? In some words, that's a significant amount. But one way you can start whittling that down and kind of looking at what's the right surface to hunt over, you start looking at download bytes. So what are the download bytes of certain actors? What are the download bytes of certain tools? Some things end up being larger than they should be in many cases, or you might even be able to look for specific bytes of some of the known stuff in the past, or the range of bytes, and look for that. And those are typical signs you can start to whittle down the traffic. So you look for the outbound traffic, you look for a certain number of bytes coming across, and then if you start to also look at the domains even more. So we'll hunt for things like, okay, this domain has just come on the network in the last 3 days, yet we see it's going outbound to, what looks like typo squatting, what looks like also, things that are again, using different ports or whatever when they're talking to it. It doesn't seem right when you look at it with the rest of the traffic on the network. Like, why is this so unique that I've got these 5 things hidden, these 2 hosts only out of 4,000, and they all seem to have, the same register and were registered last week in the registered last week outside, and yet they just hit my company within the last week. So those are great signs to kind of whittle down your hunt and look, and then you can look across those things for strange behavior and sort of dig into it. Just another way to kind of take some of that phishing activity and go beyond. We find phishing campaigns all the time using these approaches throughout. Now, if we shift a little bit into sort of some of the execution phases of, the MITRE framework, as a network hunter, SMB is just amazing what it can provide you. We'll talk a little bit more in depth on some of these, but things like ps-exec, you'd be surprised how many times the attacker doesn't actually change the service name. You do see it go across the wire. When you see the file action created, sometimes those are admins, sometimes they're bad actors. So you want to look and see, okay, is this a known user? Is it a approved tool in the enterprise? Is it this user who specifically always uses it? So for example, I ran into someone just this last week who once a month their SECM uses ps-exec to push stuff. Okay, that's great. We can isolate that out. We've got other orgs where 2 or 3 users are the ones who use it all the time. So when we see somebody else using it, that brings up another flag. And then we've got orgs that they don't use it at all, and we want to get that. And you can filter out a lot of the noise with the standard in and out stuff associated with it. So again, you're isolating it down to the user timing and again, not the noise traffic associated with it. So again, you're really looking for when it's created and it's used to be pushing tools in most cases. HTTP does similar things that we have great visibility on the network of HTTP, and we can talk the ways we can deal with encryption too through frequency analysis that helps us identify bad. But you've got user agents. Everyone's familiar with using the user agents on the endpoint. They're the same thing across the network, and the uniquer they are, the more they stick out. So if you have a way to find unique user agents across the environment, that's key. For Windows Remote Management, you can look at that. You can look for the URIs that are the WF man, and then again, you're looking for posts, the internal destinations, Things that make a lot of noise, proxies, scanners. You're going to want to know those in the enterprise, and you can quickly identify them because they're usually associated with multiple IPs, multiple user accounts. Scanners are hitting everything, so they're really easy to find, and you can just filter out those as being the key items that you would hunt for, which will get you down to a much smaller set to sort of go through. And we'll talk to a few of these a little bit more in depth now, and I want to kind of dig into a few things to be very Maze specific. So if you think about what the Maze actors do, they get into the environment usually through like an RDP or a vulnerability exploit, which we talked about up top. So you watch those, and let's say you miss them at that level, and you know, some level they've gotten into the organization because we weren't able to pick them up on the RDP and sort of lock them out, or you know, they exploited our device. We didn't have the right monitoring, so we couldn't stop them, you know, right after they got in. And again, those are two of the precursors to stopping them right at initial access. But now, okay, they're in. So what do? They're looking for password files. They're looking for ways to improve their access in the environment and get into things. And not only are they looking for password files, they're looking for your KeyPass key stores. So, you know, those of you who use KeyPass, you know, you need to be careful that Maze actors do look for that. And we went down the mindset of, okay, well, how do I mean, we see passwords all the time, password files on the network, but how do I find somebody who's looking for them? And that was the mindset we shifted to versus just seeing it. Like, we see it ourselves, but we're not looking for people who are actually looking for that data. So we shifted our approach a little bit when we went through the Maze stuff, and we started looking for, you know, the file names that we know, you know, for KeyPass. We started looking for names of the password. We did some of that, but so now that we know where it is, how do we find out if somebody's pulling it back? So now we went to the step of, let's look for what those users who are actually copying these files off or reading them off at a certain level, and let's start investigating those. And what you learn as you go into this is you're going to find multiple pivot points for passwords. So on the network, you know, these are just some of the common ones. You'll find sometimes other protocols have clear stuff all over too that shows it, but you've got basic auth, FTP clear text, you know, telnet. Maze wasn't necessarily associated with those, but you see a lot of that. So any actor that's actually sniffing the wire is going to pick that stuff up. But if you look at the SMB shares, and this is some real life examples of just what we see. So those are, again, active in customers. So it's pretty easy when you think about it. I mean, I think I know one customer that doesn't have password files in their environment, and there's a question of why at this point. But everyone that we've dealt with, and like I said, the Verizon DVR says passwords are a bigger problem than ransomware and phishing right now, and it truly is. It's one of the #1 things we see is a hygiene problem in organizations. And what you're doing is you're opening the keys to the Maze actors immediately. So how do you prevent them? Two things. One, we look for who's copying this data off. And two, we try to shut down this ability for them to even get to it. So if you're not looking for this stuff, and you're not looking for people copying them off, you're already giving the actor a step up in the environment. You know, I mean, if you've got all the payroll passwords and they're looking to take your payroll data and put it out online, you know, it's as simple for them to just look at what's being sent across the wire, figure out how to get on that server with some level of access, and then they extract it off before they encrypt. And you know, one of the things that you want to be very careful with here is, you know, we'll show you how they actually do some of that copy in a little bit, but, you know, it's a combination of just a read access initially. And what I put in front of you is an example of a KeyPass file. So when you're looking at SMB, you know, you can start with a read, but a read doesn't always mean they've copied it off. Sometimes, you know, there's some pretty good SMB tutorials that have provided some of that in here. But the real key when you're looking at it is not just a read, but you're looking for the destination bytes being larger than the source byte. And what you may not understand is the destination is not the file share. The destination is the client copying it. So some people get that backwards when they're hunting, and they actually think that they're looking at somebody who copied the files off when they're actually looking at the file just being communicated or pushed up to the share. So you want to make sure that the client bytes coming back are actually larger than the source bytes. on the reads. And you can break that down at multiple levels. You can see and validate the copy. And, one of the things we did is we just went down and broke it out, both, in and offline, as well as, in our own product. And you can see, when they pull it back, you can validate that it's been copied by looking at the hex value that we have there on the bottom. That same hex value comes up in Wireshark. So again, that's what you want to be looking for, is to validate that someone besides the normal user of that file was copying it off. Okay, if you're uploading to desktop share and then other users copying that off, why? Who's supposed to be copying that file other than the user? And then really, to even get ahead of that, why are you putting your passwords on file shares anyway? You really got to get down a route of getting people off of putting passwords in files and stuff. And these are ways you're going to stop the actor from gaining a good foothold in the environment. So when we see this, and we see it as a very big extent, these are environments we know that the actor is going to have a hard time getting kicked out of, because they've just got so many ways of access that if you can't handle a full password change across the board, which many people can't, you're basically giving them keys into multiple avenues that you may not have realized. So you can prevent them by, watching these files, watching who copies them, and slowly getting them cleaned up in the environment as fast as you can. So as you continue forward, this is just sort of summarizing what I said. So clean your hygiene on the passwords. This is a great preventive step to keep actors like Maze out of the environment. Get the key path files out, get it into a central store. That's going to be another thing. We know they're looking for them. Look for the people that are looking for them. Pivot off of those, see what else they're doing. You're going to see they're doing all kinds of other things like enumeration, which we're going to go into. To find these things as well as get more access in the environment. So those are some key things to help prevent and detect the Maze actors when they first get in the environment. Now let's talk about some of the key items that are probably more important. And there's more of these, I think, in the white paper than I have here. I'm just talking to a few of them at some level, and we'll do some level of dive on these. But you've got lots of tools, PowerView, PowerSploit, Bloodhound, that are all different ways to do enumeration, to get access, things like that. And it might be hard to detect the tool itself sometimes, but there's other things you can look at too in the environment, and some of that comes back to enumeration to help find them. So we've outlined kind of for this, 7 of those key enumerations, and I believe there's more in the white paper. But first one is just, there might be enumerating your password policy. Okay, so is complexity set? What's the length? What's the distance? That helps them if they want to try to do more brute force, things like that. What about computer names, account names? What about the network? What about file stuff? So they're enumerating all these different items in the environment, and there's lots of signs that you can pick them up. So this is where a lot of network hunting, gets deep, but it's really, really important to, if you're hunting across the network, I can't stress, and I learn daily in this area. It's a complex area, so I don't want to make it seem like it's simple. But if you don't, dig into DCE, RPC at different levels, you're really at a disadvantage from a network hunting perspective. And, I just put some basic things up here to really kind of break it down for you. These are remote procedure calls. They use certain operating numbers. And operating numbers all have certain mechanisms that, give you responses back in Windows environments when somebody's doing something. So, for example, we mentioned here, opnum 44 is when you're looking at the SAMR, for those who don't know, RPC call, this is one that looks for getting the domain password information. So, if you're not familiar with the stuff, figure out how to look at the opnums. Just hunt across your network traffic for opnum 44. Start looking at it. You're going to see there's normal users that do that. There's scanners. There's admins that have this traffic, and then you're gonna also see there's lots of ways, and we'll talk about you can continue to filter this down. Similar, you have the local security authority items that are enumerated. So I've got a couple of examples of both these on the next slide to just kind of show you what they look like. But it's pretty quick to go through and take something like, okay, who's enumerating account rights, and just go through, and if you know the hex values and stuff, you can find, certain hosts are just getting access denied all the time, and then there's a few that get in, and you can kind of look at, okay, who keeps trying and gets access denied? Is that a normal server? Why is it doing it? Okay, who's tried and got access? Why? What are they doing? And, I won't do the opnums justice in this presentation because it really could use a really good deep dive for those of you who do network hunt. And we probably will be following up this presentation and some of the white paper with some more deep dives on this stuff, because this is really where it can get a little bit complex, but yet you find there is a plethora of information to detect the tools and the mechanisms that are used from the actor is by understanding the protocol and the operating numbers. So if we look for those, and I just provided a couple of very simple examples for people to understand. So if you look at the top screenshot there, this is an example of somebody getting denied, looking for trying to enumerate account rights. And what they're doing in the LSA is they're going against the policy object database essentially, and they're looking against the policy object database. And in this case, this user's getting access denied. So that's that hex value up there, the 22 at the end there. You can actually hunt for that in the network traffic. But when you look at it, you're going to find, if you search the last day, you're probably going to find a couple of hosts across the environment that are actually triggering, this opnum, for example. And then when you do, you're going to find, okay, one's an admin, one's, maybe an exchange or some other system doing it, and then you might find something random, okay? And in some of those cases, one of those is going to be completely denied all the time, and another one's going to have a success, and you're going to say, okay, looking at the one that's getting denied, should it be, is this something that's going wrong? And you can quickly kind of pivot off that. And if it's normal behavior, maybe there's things you can clean up on the system itself. Do you have the capability to do that? But if not, you probably don't need to worry about that. Whereas you can filter down, and look at the other ones now if that's normal behavior. Similar, if you kind of look at the other example I gave you, which is the SAMR OP44. Again, this is an example of the password policy coming back from the system, and this is all network traffic. So we can see the password length is 6, and there's nothing set on it across the board. And this is a real example. So an attacker can run this fairly quickly, gets the data back, and I mean, you can hunt looking for who's going against the servers in different parts of the environment. You just hunt across the environment for opnum 44. And one, you can learn your own password policy and whether it's enforced for certain users. And two, you can see who's actually checking that data and investigate those hosts. And if you do find you've got complexity problems, you can now go back to your IT department or whoever maintains this and ask them why these settings aren't set. And again, it goes back to preventive. So now, I've made it easier. They're able to pull it back and there's no real challenges in it. So again, trying to help get ahead of this and also find the actor when they're trying to execute these type of commands. I'm going to talk a little bit about lateral movement here, and this is just another example. It had a lot of items on it that'll help us kind of spin down the wheel a little bit here in the maze. But again, like I said, the whole report's broken out this way, and each of these are broken down, and then there's some hunting tips in the back of the white paper also. But if we look at, again, maze, and I don't know if anybody ever had one of those little hand toys, and this is an automated one. It's always a pain in the butt to get through the maze, and you have some of those challenges with the actor too. So one of the simplest things that no one really hunts for across the environment is just looking at the files sometimes. And the maze actors use text files, batch files, zip, and some other archives. Most of them do use those items, and you'll be surprised how many of these actors are passing multiple text and bat files across the network, yet no one's really hunting for bat and text files. Tell you what, if you hunt for bat files across your network, you're going to find a lot of scripts you shouldn't have either. It's kind of amazing to find how bad your hygiene is when you start hunting for things like that. So, but if you're just hunting for bat files or text files, you're going to get so much data back that it's impossible to really hunt through. And if you don't have a good way to filter that down, it becomes even more difficult. So you want to kind of isolate that at some level and look at, okay, why is the same file set going to multiple hosts? Why is a batch of stuff, going to multiple destinations that is different in the environment? Because you're going to see a lot of people, they're kind of binary in their communication. They go up to their shared drives, things like that. Only certain servers are pushing to all hosts. So if you can get in and look at the network of like, why is this system pushing to multiple hosts or replicating itself across the directory share, also the file share. So you see that with things like Conti and that it replicates the text files across the shares, things like that. If you can see that and trigger on that type of behavior, you're going to, again, get ahead of the encryption a lot of times. And they're already so far down the state that now they're just starting to get their real good foothold, but you still have a chance, with that indicator to quickly shut down, contain it before you're actually encrypted in the environment. And again, you can use hashes. Regex works great where it's not, where you have the visibility. So, you should be able to regex across your traffic at any level. You'd be surprised, one of the file names was mimi.zip. I mean, that's a regex. Why couldn't you pick that up going across? You'd be surprised how many of the tools are also using those names. When they FTP out, they use directories like Cobalt, things like that. That's all can be picked up via regex if they're trying to beacon and stuff, and they make the mistakes of leaving those in clear text at any level, anywhere in the environment. And then you can also look at the different certificates on them. So let's just a little bit more. Here's an example we provided of sort of looking at, some of the management on lateral movement. So again, when RM was used, you could look at the user agent, but if you look and you're able to look across the network, you can see in that graphic, it's got PS version 5.1. So that's an example of, why is the WinRM client being kicked off from PowerShell? Do you do that in your org? Is that new? Why are you doing that? And there are legit reasons why organizations do that, but things like that should stick out to you. You should go in and look at them. You should pivot around that traffic and see why. So again, just another example of if the users use PowerShell or different things like that to kick off the process, you should see some of that in the environment. Another step kind of in the lateral movement, and again, going back to some of the opnums, and again, I can't stress how important the RPC interface stuff is, and learning that from a network perspective, because it really will help you find different things that are just bad activity in your environment, as well as it will help you catch some of these actors before they're too far down the route. And I know we're getting close to the end here, so I'm going to go through this fairly quick. These are again, just some of the different opnums you can look for, and TSCon hijacks the remote management stuff. These are some of the opnums you can look for to try to find that activity. I encourage you, if you're a network threat hunter, put things like TSCon in a lab, run it from system to system, try to get these things looking. It'll help you be quicker at identifying, these types of services when they come up. And usually you got to look at a stream of data on them in certain orders to help pick them up. So just looking for these opnums alone, you're going to have to kind of understand and look at the stream of how it kicked off. Sometimes, you need to see 12 may have been done before 45, and how do they all tie up to the same user? And that's stuff we can't necessarily go into depth on here, but it's important to understand. You want to look at the stream of data when you're hunting these things. And then let's shift over to kind of where it starts to get too late. And, C2 is one thing. I can't tell you, we get triggered all the time on ICMP tunnels, SSH, things coming out of there. Those are just protocols you should be looking at. How are they used? Why are they even being used in your environment for certain things? And then start looking at them against hard-coded IPs, rare IPs in the environment. Those are really kind of key things. This IP just came into my environment 3 days ago. Why has it got an SSH tunnel out to it? Those are items that we find a lot of times. In fact, that's how that Maze IOC hit earlier. It was just an SSH tunnel. It was a rare IP that had only been in an environment a few days. And then, you also have all the IOCs and stuff on Cobalt Stripe beacons. So, again, this is how they're getting their money. This is how they're getting out of the environment. You need to be able to look at that C2 activity, look at the uniqueness of the IPs, the domains, the protocols, and dig them out and hunt that. And once you filter out some of the common items, it's pretty easy to see with a little bit of frequency analysis, some of the items that should be investigated. This is a point of you're already encrypted in most cases. I think you have a couple exceptions where, you know, although Conti's one of the fastest ones, it copies the text file before it encrypts. But, you know, there's more than 100 ransomware file extensions. If you don't know that, you should, you know, get those. You can hunt across the network for those. The challenge with that is you got things like .bin, things like that, you know, you're hunting for a file called .bin, you're going to get a lot of things back. So, you know, they become hard to deal with. And the actors shifted to things like that a little more, it'd be hard. But I think you'll see a lot of these attacks right now, they're different extensions. They're not the common, like, operating system extensions. So you can hunt for these known extensions across the wire, see what's going out. But at this point, you know, you've already seen encryption and it's getting too late. And you can stop the impact of the encryption at that point, which again is just another phase in the attack of getting them. So you want to be hunting for that stuff across SMB, ACP, etc. And then the last thing I would say, you know, once you pick it up, you know, an EDR is the key to containing it. So we talked mostly about network, but, you know, I really want to focus, there's the combination of the network, the log, and the endpoint. And again, EDR is going to be your best bet at containing that. You know, network stuff, you can block, things like that. You can send TCP resets. But, you know, if you're not running EDR at some level and using that in tandem, you're really doing a disservice to stop against these actors too. And again, you know, what I wanted to stress through this, and the white paper goes into much more detail on some of these, that there's probably about 20 early warning signs and also things that you can clean up and make it more difficult in your environment. The network helps find those pretty quickly, especially if it's on unmanaged devices, things like that you can't cover. So really, you know, look to leverage the data in it. You know, be more than happy to answer questions on the depth of some of the optimums, and we will come out with more detail on that as we move forward to show exactly how we're sort of hunting for that stuff, and, you know, how we find examples of people doing, you know, enumeration and then switching over and taking advantage of the environment. You know, and again, it's not just Maze, there's multiple other actors to do it, but these are very focused on what Maze did. We spent quite a bit of time really dissecting it down to understand that. And just to wrap it up, and then we'll go to questions. The white paper is out online, I believe. It's posted in the chat. And, you know, it is about the early warning signs that the network gives you, a little bit different visibility than you might see on the endpoint, and how to get ahead of both the hygiene that leads them into stuff, as well as how to find them using each of their tactics at different phases in MITRE. And, you know, if you run into this stuff, we absolutely do incident response. We're very familiar with the ransomware strains out there and how to deal with containment and stuff around them. So that's what I have today, and let's go ahead and open up the questions and see how I can help anyone.
Thank you so much for that, Jason. I know the audience appreciated this all as well. Thank you. We do have a few questions, as we've noted in the chat, that came through the Q&A. For those who still have questions, please type them. Even if we don't have time, we will get the answers to you. By the way, as Jason mentioned, the link for the Maze report is inside the chat. And to kick off the first question of the day, Jason, you described looking for vulnerability exploits or password files. Are these variables or types of attacks the Awake platform automatically looks for, and can I create my own hunt, if you will?
Yeah, the answer to that is twofold. Yes, you can create your own hunt, and I'll get into that in a minute. But by default, the Awake platform will find all your hygiene compliance issues, the passwords. So there's automated models that look for that across the board and can trigger you on a regular basis. Similar to exploits, you know, we basically go through, we dissect the exploits, we find out how to identify them, and then we create models and those automatic trigger. The one great thing about the Wake platform, if you think of sort of Splunk over logs, the Wake platform lets you query over every bit of the network traffic. So, you know, we can find the exploits, we can find the people looking at the exploits, we can find your scanners, all that just by querying. And again, if there's too much data on the query, you can filter that down with exceptions, and then you turn it into an automated model at that point.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I believe the second question, Jason, will then be, you mentioned the average You mentioned the average is about 3 days from initial access to the destruction. Is that true in general? What has your experience been with other ransomware actors?
Yeah, I mean, 3 days is used on some of the public reports. I think you'll see that varies here and there. And then I'm going to shift to Conti, which, there's been a lot of talk about that because they got like 32 processors behind them in the cloud and they do quick encryption. We actually ran the Conti samples and have dealt with IR on it. And it's about 10 minutes. But the real key of an actor like Conti, and, the early warning signs still work, and I'll explain why. They typically go off of TrickBot and Emotet, and they're using that initial foothold. So a lot of the stuff up front, you still can detect them coming in from RDP, exploits. They're then getting a foothold and enumerating the passwords even before they start to kick off that encryption. And what they do is they replicate the Conti text, malware, and they send it out through a user account. So again, you've got multiple stages before you hit them, before that 10-minute cycle of encryption comes in on it. And then when you start seeing the Conti text file hit everyone, that's when you're in a lot of trouble at that point. But you still have, multiple days, even though they advertise it's like a 10-minute encryption. Likely you have hours to days with somebody like that. It depends on how fast they can compromise the accounts through TrickBot and Emotet and stuff.
Okay, thank you for that one as well. Let's see, this one came in, Jason. This might actually be a follow-up to the first question, but there was confusion. It sounds like this needs to be a combination of network threat hunting and data science to catch some of these early warning signs that we were just kind of focusing in on for the ones that can still come in. If not, I worry we would have too many false positives looking through SMB traffic, etc. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a valid item, especially until you understand the environment. Anyone who's doing enumeration against the domain, if you looked at that traffic, you're just going to be lost in the beginning. Okay? I mean, the reality is there's so many items coming back. And even if you're trying to find domains or rare IPs, how do you go about that? So, there is a level of human hunting through that, but you really need to be able to take that data that you're human hunting, those tactics, pull it back, and machine learning can help with things like what we call device characteristics, for example. We can see unique devices with unique connections outbound. So it's pretty easy for me to see this device has 100% of the traffic going to these two IPs, and they've got SSH tunnels. So we can isolate that pretty quick on our side, which speeds up the investigation and the manual hunt. And other times we're using queries hunting, and then we might pivot back to that machine learning frequency analysis type data to, find other parts of the possible attack at that point too.
Thank you for the answer, Jason. I'm sure is what somebody in the crowd is saying. Second question, fourth question, what is your advice and guidance on incident response and forensic processes around ransomware? How is that playbook different from maybe a more traditional IR one?
Yeah, I mean, every IR has a little bit of difference. If you talk about business email compromise, you're going through 0365 logs and you're looking for specifics on that. You got a nation state, you got different containment strategies you got to look at. Otherwise, they may entrench in a foothold you don't know. But ransomware specifically, the biggest challenge, and I'll give you an example we ran into about a week and a half ago. If you got a critical system that the cities, the states, the public depends on, and it's been hit, you're so worried as a customer basically of ours to get that system up and running that your first reaction is just to set it up. And the challenge with when you do that is you get reinfected most times because you really haven't dealt with the response correctly. And you need a strategy when you come in. You need to have a very clear strategy of, we've got to get eyes on the network fairly quick and the endpoint, okay? And that means I want to look and see what's going on, where the compromises are. You got to come up with a strategy that has a way to build things clean if they're already encrypted off of the core network with new credentials, things like that, so that if it is a truly high priority service, you want to work that strategy in parallel, get it up. But if you don't separate the accounts, if you don't get it off the network, you're likely going to get infected again. And one of the harder challenges that you have to deal with in ransomware a lot of times is people just can't change passwords across the board. They have apps that they really haven't done their work on and things like that. So it becomes fairly difficult. And if you also don't know what they've done and what counts they've compromised, you're likely going to get hit again. So I guess what I'm stressing is you got to have a separate network, you got to have a good password item, but in general, this all leads up to you got to have a really good plan of attack going in day one to investigate and set up in parallel and make sure that parallel setup's not going to get compromised.
It's so based on the explanation of the different plays that you went through, are you all automating these hunts, or we do threat hunting once a week, and by then it's just going to be too late unless we just get lucky? Is the question here? For like
yeah, I mean we hunt all the time. Once a week hunts are like that to me is kind of dangerous. I know you've only got certain manpower and things to do that. We do hunts, let's call them once a week, or random and sporadic all the time, a lot of times based on intelligence, things like that. So like, yesterday I'm learning about SunCrypt and what it's doing and stuff. As soon as I got that knowledge, I turned it into a hunt. I don't wait for a schedule or anything. We go through, we start hunting. And then what we do is we find and we whittle down data so it's not too noisy. We can save that in the Awake platform, turn it into an automated model to trigger on us moving forward. There are still massive data hunts that, go on regularly, and we probably do them daily, every other day, certain things, but as many as you can that you can isolate, filter out the exceptions and turn into something that triggers you always, that's really the goal you want to do. And we have hundreds of models that actually do that, that we've leveraged from hunts and converted to automated models within Awake.
Okay, and then I think there's two other questions here. We'll try to get them. The next one would be, would these detections be specific to Maze, or are they common to other ransomware families? They've kind of gone through.
Yeah, there are some differences across ransomware families, so I don't want to say it's 100% covers everything else, but a lot of the items are very common. I mean, the majority of ransomware stuff today is exploits or RDP. So again, that's your first gate to shut them out. Most of the actors are looking for password files. KeyPass is a little unique to Maze, and it was something we weren't really looking for, and Maze sort of tipped us off that, oh, maybe we should look for KeyPass files and who's taking them. But passwords in general are looked for by most actors, pull them off. C2, all those tactics, they're pretty common among most of the actors. You've got a few of them like Conti and that's why I brought it up, that has a little bit different encryption mechanism that, writes and then encrypts. But otherwise, there's a pretty significant overlap of how most ransomware can be investigated and prevented that we went over today is aligned with Maze.
I see. And the final question is, I see some recent ransomware attacks in the news where the victim had the ability to recover, but chose to pay the ransom to prevent data disclosure. Do you have any insights to how victims are able to confirm the data has been destroyed? Do you know of any cases where the data was released after a ransom was paid? Is there honor among thieves almost? What a question.
Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with somebody who encrypted you and did that. I mean, the reality is if you're underneath watching onion sites and your data comes up, that's about the only way you're gonna watch it. And there's really no way to validate it that they've destroyed it. They can tell you or whatever, but who's to say that they didn't copy it off, put it on a drive for later for whatever reason? I mean, the key is you just have to kind of be diligent in monitoring. The biggest thing is that it may keep you out of the media initially, but it doesn't mean you didn't get breached. So you really probably have the right integrity level that you have to notify people you were breached.